Happy New Year! Hello and welcome to PolyCosm. My name's Christina, and for the first video of 2021 I wanted to kind of do something a little bit fun, a little bit different. So I wanted to do a side quest video where I basically create this retrofuturistic prop design. So I'm gonna start kind of like modeling it first, and then I'm gonna like throw in a bunch of textures and try to like project that from view. I haven't done too many videos on that, so hopefully you guys are gonna learn something new and interesting. This whole video is like inspired by Ian Hubert's kind of way of working. I've learned so much from his Patreon. So honestly, if you like this video, I would highly recommend checking out Ian Hubert's stuff. Like, it's really good. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, so before starting any designs, I tend to kind of put together a mood board like this, and I kind of get an idea of the general silhouette, which you can see here is inspired by a metal detector. And I should probably mention, but what we're making is a matter detector. So this kind of sci-fi retrofuturistic object that kind of detects different types of matter. So we're gonna have a lot of these kind of retro screens and like really cheesy stuff, but I really like that kind of stuff. And I actually saw this like globe thing, which I think would be really cool to incorporate. And I've just been looking at a lot of kind of different sources of inspiration, from like TV stuff to radios. Been looking into like some military stuff because that tends to just have like lots of knobs and all kinds of screens and buttons and stuff like that. I also wanted to kind of have this kind of printer, so this readings printer that kind of prints out like readings. This is like a really old school kind of ticket printer, I think. And as for the scanner wheel itself, which would be at the bottom here, I've kind of been looking at like kind of retro steering wheels from like retro cars. I just saw this shape and I thought it was very cool. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of combine a lot of these elements and hopefully come up with something interesting. I've also added just like a visual style to kind of give you guys an idea of kind of like what type of style I'm going for, because I could make this like super military, but instead I'm kind of going to go down a bit more of like a quirky route and see if I can kind of get something close to this. As for the palette, since we're going like very retro, I kind of wanted to go like retro 60s with this. I was thinking like a quirky palette like this would be really cool. So yeah, let's get started on the modeling. So the first thing I'm going to do when blocking out this matter detector is to use real world references. And since we have this metal detector, I actually found one here in Sketchfab that is actually the exact same model. And so I'm going to use this for reference to kind of just get a sense of scale, because I need to make sure the length between this top part and this bottom part where it's being held is correct, and also how tall it is. If you bring in a default cube, this is 2 meters and the one I brought in was pretty big, so I'm actually just going to size that down a bit. So I'll be using this for my design. I'm just going to use it as kind of scale reference and size reference. Starting off, I added in a plane, pressed M to merge everything down to one vertice, and just started extruding that vertice. This is going to serve as the shape for the rod, and as you can see, I'm kind of following the general shape of the metal detector on the left, just to kind of make sure that I have the correct shape and that it's going to be comfortable to like hold on to. Once I was done, I added in a subdivision modifier just to kind of smooth out everything, and converted the mesh to a curve, and then added some dimension to that curve under the bevel menu, which you can find under the curves menu. Oh, and I should probably mention, this isn't going to be a super tutorial-y video, but rather just a time-lapse of the process with some voiceover to sort of explain the process and what I was thinking when creating this matter detector. The main shortcuts and tools I'll be using a lot is E for extruding, I for insetting faces, and Ctrl B to bevel edges. I know my way of working is a sort of dirty way of working, and the topology might not be the best, but that's kind of not my intended purpose anyway. I just want to end up with a cool design in the end, and since we'll be projecting textures later on, that will hide a lot of the ugliness. I bet some of you expert modelers are pulling your hair out. Is it weird that I derive a little pleasure from modeling in a chaotic manner? Right, back to the model. In the beginning of any modeling phase, I try to just block out the general silhouette first, not really worrying about detail too much. Since we'll be projecting a lot of textures, some of that detail will come from that texture, and we'll see a lot of happy accidents happen, so I try not to worry about the detailing too much right now. With a lot of the primitive shapes I'm using, I try to avoid having super crisp edges. I find that beveling tends to add a lot of dimension and makes it feel more handmade rather than a machine in a factory creating perfect versions of props. And since the textures we'll be projecting have a lot of those type of imperfections, dirt and grit to them, reflecting that same type of imperfection in the topology actually really helps sell that feeling. I want this matter detector to have seen better days and have been used a fair bit in difficult terrain. Oh, here I am using a rectangle as a boolean to cut out 2 holes for the strap to go through. And to do that, select your boolean, shift select your model and hit Ctrl numpad-. If you're unable to do that, just make sure the bool tool add-on is enabled under preferences. Once I'm happy with the boolean, I hit apply in the modifier panel, and at this point I start working on some of the screens. I actually had no idea how these would end up. Honestly, I just had a vague idea of the shapes being rounded to kind of get that retro-futuristic feel, and oh boy did I overcomplicate the topology here. This later presented some issues when projecting textures, so I mean, just keep that in mind. The more angular your model, the easier it is to project flat textures and have that come across as believable. But since we'll be viewing this part from afar, I actually wasn't too concerned about this fact. At some point though, I had to readjust the positioning of the screen and handle because it just didn't feel quite right scale-wise. I probably should have imported a DAS model for reference, but laziness. You'll see me using a lot of proportional editing, which has the keyboard shortcut O, or you can just press the little button up here. This allows me to move the surrounding area of a selection in a more organic manner, and you can scroll up and down to choose the area of effect. I use this all the time when modeling. And time for some scanner fun. Just 2 days after, and I sort of regret not coming up with something that spins. I kind of feel that would have felt more sci-fi, but on the other side, I was trying to mimic a sort of metal detector feeling. It's that whole battle of, do I just want this to look cool, or do I want people to immediately recognize its intended purpose? That's always a difficult question to answer in my opinion. As you can see on screen, I used a lot of the same faces from the original shape, duplicated them in edit mode, and pressed P to separate that selection. I then extruded it and used that as a boolean shape to cut out some nice holes in the scanner. I also used booleans to cut out some general shapes, holding the scanner together at the bottom. Again, using Ctrl numpad- is just such a fast way of working. If you don't have the bool tool add-on enabled, just do it. It's honestly just a great way of like stumbling onto happy accidents. So to give us a little break from all the explaining, and since what I'm doing on screen is pretty self-explanatory, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the year that's been. I know, you're sick of hearing YouTubers talk about how awful 2020 was, but I'm not gonna do that. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was an awful year in general because of the pandemic, but I personally am very happy with all that we've managed to accomplish here on PolyCosm last year. You might not know this, but we launched this channel in March, I think, and we've been seeing so many people enjoying our content and learning a lot, and that honestly just makes me so happy. Not to get all sappy, but helping other artists has just been such a joy and pleasure, and you guys are so freaking supportive. It's amazing. I know people call Blender a cult, but God, I mean, the community is just so great. How can you not join the cult? I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you guys, and we're really looking forward to creating a whole lot more content. Just as a little teaser, we're actually planning on releasing Unreal and game-related content this year, so that's freaking exciting. I've actually always dreamt of creating games, so I hope to take you guys on that journey and hopefully we can learn together. Okay, so now that 2 people remain, let's get into some fusebox action. What you're seeing on screen is basically the creation of some fuses that I decided to add to this little fuse box attached to the rod that would sort of power up the prop. I also wanted to add lots of buttons and a large round screen on the back. I thought this addition would definitely make this prop feel more sci-fi and stylized and less metal detector-y. Is that even a word? And of course with fuses you have to have cables. Cables make any prop feel more sci-fi, so I just added in some Bezier curves and added depth to them under the bevel menu again. And in edit mode, you basically just rotate the points with R or double R. That makes you kind of freely rotate things around. Move them with G, and you can also scale the adjustment anchors with S. Oh, and if you ever want to like lengthen any of the points, you just press E to extrude. At this point, I looked at my reference and I felt that it wasn't quite retrofuturistic in terms of silhouette, so I decided to add some funky curved parts to give our prop a little bit of personality. Again, using proportional editing was really helpful to get a nice organic feeling to the shape. And once I was happy, I extruded the plane and decided to use some Booleans to help cut out some shapes. By the way, if you're cutting out several shapes, I recommend duplicating the objects while in edit mode instead of using the Boolean function 3 times on 3 individual shapes. You could always scale and move the shapes within edit mode. Just saves you a bit of time and makes your viewport way less cluttered. And also I just basically copied this shape around and just moved the Booleans. That's the great thing about Booleans. You can like keep them editable, so you can kind of edit them even if you move the shape around or change the original shape itself. So if you're used to my content, you must be so sick of hearing me gush about Booleans, but honestly, they are such a great tool. I love them. Now that most of the basic shapes are down, let's start working on some details. If you look at my reference board, you can see the type of retro screen I had planned for the back. I don't know what it is about retrofuturistic design, but I just love that aesthetic. That and Art Deco, oh boy. I'll have to design something Art Deco-y one day soon. Anyway, I used the tool Grid Fill to fill in the hole that I just cut out, and using proportional editing, you can choose a point and sort of pull out from that point, and I use this to create a rounded screen. Rounded screens are super retro, so I just had to include that in the design. I also threw on a subdivision modifier to make sure that the screen was smoother and more rounded. And the great thing is, once you've already modeled something, there's nothing stopping you from reusing that model in other places. This will also help keep the design more coherent and make it so that everything feels like it belongs together. As for the buttons, since they're such small objects, I tried not to get too carried away with the detailing, but just added in some bevels to make them look a bit more three-dimensional. I also added some knobs that can be turned and some flick switches. Having references like the ones I have on screen is always a big help. You might think, I know what buttons look like, but then you look at reference and you're like, oh, I like that shape. I should use that shape. And suddenly your prop has just a bit more uniqueness to it. Sticking to what's inside your brain can limit you quite a bit, because you might immediately go straight to the generic stuff or the things you've like seen 1,000 times before. So it's always something to like keep in mind, you know? And speaking of not using references, I know I'm such a freaking hypocrite. I sort of winged it for the printer screen thing, but in retrospect, I wish that I'd looked at some like retro TVs or something, because the shape I ended up with just looks like a random blob rather than having an actual design to it. In the end, the textures helped give me a bit of dimension, but I really wish I just looked at more references. And aha, the globe is finally being implemented. I did find a place for it. I have no idea what the heck this globe actually does in terms of function, but I really just wanted one. Just let me have it, okay? Ooh, this part was really fun. So if you want to make a screw or spring-like object, add in a single vertex and offset it in a direction in edit mode. Add the screw modifier and adjust the settings to your liking. I knew I wanted the end to connect to a socket at the bottom and a socket at the top. So once I was happy, I converted this to a curve and added more dimension to it, like I've done a few times already. And after that, I just manipulated the points to wherever they needed to be fed into. And of course, instead of having the cables just feed right into a flat surface, we need a socket for it to connect to. I used a worm gear, which I think is included in the model extras that you can enable in the add-on panel. And as an addition, I just made some extra base connectors at the front and bottom, joined the models with Ctrl-J and just moved them to the correct places. These small details like really add up eventually, so I highly recommend you thinking about those kind of things. Creating the strap was fairly easy. I just needed to add a few edge loops to a plane, use proportional editing to manipulate the plane into a curved surface, extruded, beveled edges, and duplicated the curved bit with Ctrl-D before merging the edge gaps with F, which stands for fill, by the way. That's kind of how I remember that keyboard shortcut. I added edge loops to where I wanted the strap to have crisp edges and threw on a subdivision modifier before fitting it to the strap holder holes. As for the printer device, I ended up using a little bit of a different technique. By adding in a circle, you can delete points, extrude, and connect points with F. I wanted to design a silhouette similar to the reference on screen. How I'd fit this into the actual printer screen thing itself was a mystery to me, but it was sort of a trial and error process. I mean, I had no set design going into this, so you kind of just have to like wing it and improvise. Once I was happy with the silhouette, I selected all the vertices in edit mode, hit F to fill in the shape, and E to extrude it. I then beveled the flat surfaces to get a bit more depth. Using the knife tool, I connected the vertices from the left to the right side and hit enter to confirm. I then chose these vertices, straightened them in the Z-axis by hitting S for scale and then numpad 0 and Z. This was to help make it easier to inset some of the faces that I wanted to add to the printer. But before actually committing to that design choice, I needed to attach this to our printer screen for a bit of context to see how both of these things would fit together. When creating the paper, I chose to use another curve, just like before, but instead of using the bevel menu, I chose to extrude it under the geometry menu. That makes it completely flat, but you can still edit the points around using the curve handles, so this is really good for like papers and books and stuff like that. This marked the very last stretch of the modeling process. I mean, I could make the prop more detailed, but you'll see me add a bit of that detail based on the textures I project on top. So with that said, let's move on to the second phase, the texturing phase. First off, I decided to import my reference palette using the Import Images from Planes add-on and made the texture an emissive texture instead of the principled BSDF. This is to make sure that the colors are more true and unaffected by any lights in the scene. Before texture projecting any textures, I decided to just lay down some base colors to get a feeling of what the palette would look like. I also wanted to decide whether parts were made out of plastic, metal, glass, and so on. You'll see me slowly drift away from my initial palette intention later on, and actually end up with quite a different outcome from what I originally expected, but hey, that's sort of the point with these experimentations, isn't it? Starting off with our first example, I wanted to work on the round screen on the fuse box thing. I made sure I was in orthographic view, headed into edit mode and selected the middle vertice and hit Ctrl numpad plus to expand the selection. You can also hit minus to reduce that selection. I created a new material, assigned it and tried finding the texture I wanted to use, and then drag and dropped it in, and while hovering over the viewport hit U for unwrap and project from view. In the UV editor, I can now choose these same vertices and move them around wherever I want on the texture. I can scale it up and down and move it around with G and rotate with R if I wanted to. As you can see, I actually changed my mind, so I chose to just project the entire thing rather than just the glass. Already looking great, I love it. Moving on to our second screen, I created a new material. And now you're gonna see what I meant by how projecting textures on something a bit more organic is a lot more difficult. I'll end up changing this later on. From now I just projected from view and kind of moved things around in the UV editor until I found something that looked somewhat decent. Once I was happy, I added in a color ramp and tried to get closer to the original color palette that I had chosen. I then selected the vertices I wanted the screen to cover, added a new texture and hit assign. With this new texture, I dropped in another image, and since we already had the UVs projected, I just needed to size the UVs up in the UV editor to fit the screen on the right. And to give our screen a little more realism in terms of reflections, I chose to add a musgrave texture to the roughness input. Just make sure you have an HDRI map when doing this to see how the reflections interact with the surroundings. So because the textures just didn't look right, I chose to mark some seams under the UV menu. This will sort of split these two separate parts, and a UV map will be generated for each part. If I now press unwrap under the UV unwrap menu, which has the keyboard shortcut U if you've forgotten, these two parts will be generated and I can move them independently of each other. As for the buttons, I just selected them individually and projected from view. And from the new texture map I assigned, I just moved them around on the keyboard to find buttons that fit the individual shapes. I repeated this process for most of the buttons, knobs, and switches. And to add a little texture to some of the buttons, I connected the texture map to the height input of a bump node before feeding it into normal. The normal will use the information from the texture and generate some height texture. And this is exactly what I was talking about in regards to modeling based on textures. Here, this texture has provided us with a great opportunity to use the knife tool and cut out some shapes. Once happy, extrude these parts. I also chose to extrude the bottom panel inwards. As for the scanner part at the bottom, I chose to project a grid texture and make this material metal and reflective. Moving forward, this process is just repeated over and over and over again with different materials. Hopefully you've managed to get a good idea of how this workflow works. When it came to the organic forms, I mostly tried to mark seams and split up the different parts to be textured. I just found this way of working to yield the best results. You can overlay the UVs on top of each other, although in practice this is usually advised against. But again, this is only intended for visual development purposes, so I'm not too worried about that. You can even see that when I'm using the knife tool here and extruding. Like, the shapes aren't perfect, but from a distance you won't really notice these kind of things. If you ever find that a UV part doesn't look good, just move those faces in the UV editor around to somewhere else on the image texture. Sometimes choosing other UV options like hue projection might work the best, so I advise to try just all of the different options. Somewhere along the way, I managed to mess up the textures on this fuse box, so I chose to reproject some new textures, and I actually felt it looked a bit better this way, so I mean, I'm not complaining. And since I'm obsessed with this globe idea, I of course had to project one of the inspiration images actually. At this point, I was sort of done with all the texture projecting, but I just wasn't sold on the color palette. Something about it made it come across as more toy-like, if that makes sense. And I think it's mostly due to the bold color choices. You know how Nerf guns have those in-your-face color palettes? Yeah, that's sort of the vibe I was getting, so I ended up just changing the colors around a lot with the color ramps I had, and in the end I think I actually managed to get something a bit more fitting. Alright, so after messing around for what felt like ages, I think I'm finally done. I think I'm happy with this kind of color palette because it still comes across as sci-fi and retrofuturistic, which was my goal, but it also kind of comes across as like, you know how like spacesuits and kind of space stations are designed. It kind of has that kind of feel, and I actually quite like it. I'm actually quite happy with this end result, I think. So if I zoom into the different parts, so this is obviously where you would strap in your arm and you'd be looking down at the screen like this. So you have this like knob thing that you can turn, you have all these buttons, and here is the fuse box. So this would be the reader. And then you have these like fuses and all the buttons, of course, that connect into the rod and powers it. And here you got the printer. So you got the little screen, you got all the printing doohickeys on the side, and also this little globe thing that kind of, I have no idea what this is for. But I'm sure it makes sense in some way. And this is obviously some more data screen. And if we go down, yeah, this is the scanner part, so it kind of looks the same on the underside as well. And yeah, that is pretty much it. I think it turned out pretty alright. I don't know what you guys think. I think it turned out pretty okay. Here's just a little sheet for presentation's sake. Although it might not have turned out the way I expected, I think it's quite alright. Oh, and I did want to include one little bit at the end, and that is if you have the SimpleBake add-on, which I've made a tutorial on before, baking the textures of this thing would be super simple. So let's say I wanted to bake this fuse box. If I enter edit mode, you can see we have a lot of overlapping UVs, but that doesn't really matter much as long as it's kind of its own texture. If you have several textures here, like this one, for example, that has two, this won't really work as well. I think then you'd have to arrange so that the UVs just aren't overlapping. But let's choose this one and let's go into cycles because we need to be in cycles to render this properly. And let's go down to the SimpleBake menu. And if we bring up our shader, let's see what we actually have to change. So we need a metal, we need a specular, and we also need a roughness. We could include the normal, but I'm just not going to do that right now. So if we go down to 1K, I want to export the bakes. I also want to copy objects and apply bakes. And as for the memory limit, I'm going to set that to no limit. So I'm going to bake this and show you what happens. And there we go. If I press onto the new object and enter edit mode, you can see that a new texture has been generated that matches our UV unwrap, and also everything here in the shader editor has just been simplified. So you have the PBR diffuse, you have the PBR metalness, specular, and roughness. And all of these are exported into its own folders, so you can now like import that into a game engine and export this with those maps. And that's it. I hope you learned something from this video. I think texture projecting is just so much fun, and I really have to thank Ian Hubert for introducing the concept to me. I was always afraid of texturing, but look at me now. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Oh, and Happy New Year's again. Bye!